Today, we've been talking about exposure throughout the week, really, and how exposure is so crucial in terms of your career development. And exposure is often something we look at with networking, but actually part of your job can give you opportunities for exposure. And one of the key ways of doing that is through meetings. So you will naturally be invited probably to a lot of meetings, probably maybe more meetings than maybe you want to be invited to. But as you're going into those meetings, it's ideal if people come away remembering who you are, and to varying degrees, depending on how many people are in that meeting, your seniority and your role within that meeting. It's not really about you being the most memorable person in every meeting, but we're just here looking for some kind of ways that we can make sure that people remember that we were there and remember that we were part of the conversation. So I'm going to focus on how we can make sure we're making an impact sort of visually, physically, so in the room and on Zoom, and then some of the tips I've got for making you feel more comfortable speaking up, or making you feel better about not interrupting people if you're on the other side of the scale with that one as well. So let's take a look first of all at Zoom meetings, because this is, I think, still where most of us are spending most of our time. So the nature of Zoom meetings, I find that each organisation seems to have its own culture on whether or not it's encouraged or normal to turn your camera on. And what I really encourage you to do is just start to make sure that that's standard practice for you. Now, I don't want to encourage anyone to get into what we call Zoom fatigue, where you're constantly having your camera on. But I want you to think about this more when there is a meeting with certain people that you want to recognise you and remember you and your brand, or when there is a topic that you want people to associate with you more. Those are the ones where you want to make a little bit more of an effort with this. So the reason I'm kind of really keen on cameras is this psychology of familiarity. Some of you might have heard me talk about this before. It's one of the really simple psychology sort of tricks that we can embed into the way that we work. And this is essentially about the way that the more you see someone, the more familiar they become to you, and the more you like them, the more rapport you have with them. And I often talk about this in terms of when you get on the train and you see the same person on the train, and you start saying hello to them, good morning to them, and you're thinking, I've got no idea who you are. And then you bump into them somewhere else and you get really excited because you've seen them somewhere else, even though you still got no idea who they are. But you have a rapport with them that you don't have with anybody else there, just because you recognise them. And that's really how simple this is. You see people all the time, you're going to feel a bit of rapport with them. So for example, I know that there's some of you on here that we've messaged back and forth over time, whether it's on Instagram or on TikTok or LinkedIn, and then when we actually meet in person for the first time, it doesn't feel like the first time because it feels like we already know each other. And that's this psychology of familiarity. Just because you've seen people a lot, you're seeing their names pop up, feels like you're kind of building that connection. And video on is a very simple way of doing this. So for example, yesterday I did a session. I think there were about 50 people in the session. And I'd probably say about half had their camera on. Now, the way that it works for me is I'm talking, I'm going to look to the people with their camera on because I'm looking at their body language, I'm looking at their facial expressions. I'm thinking, am I making sense here? Am I interesting? Am I boring them? So as me talking, I'm going to be looking to the people with cameras on. So even if you're not doing much talking, if your camera is on, those people leading the meeting that are contributing the most are more likely to be looking towards you, because they still want that instant feedback on how their messages are coming across. So we want to firstly have the camera on, and we want to make sure we're looking towards the camera. So we're engaging towards where the camera actually is rather than where your face is. And this is particularly challenging in Teams, because Teams shove you right down the bottom. So if I just do it here and I talk to the bottom right-hand side of my phone, you're probably going to find that a lot less engaging than when I'm talking towards camera, because this feels like I'm talking to you, this feels like I'm talking to somebody else, but you're kind of eavesdropping in the conversation. So you want to make sure you're looking towards the camera, but also you're showing you're engaged through your body language. And that can simply be smiling and nodding. Okay? That's enough. But even better if you're leaning in at certain points. When we're really interested in something, we'll lean towards it. So that's a brilliant way on video of demonstrating interest in your body language. Also make sure you've always updated your name and your full name, first name and surname, Because like I say, sometimes the recognition for me is just the username, the name of somebody. Hey, I can recognise their name before I recognise their face. And the same thing, you know, on Zoom, you're going to look at and take in people's names, but also use the chat box so your name comes up more clearly. So even if you're just sort of going in and saying, great idea, or fantastic conversation, thanks for sharing that. Just anything in the chat box that's going to show you participating in the conversation, then that's going to make sure people acknowledge you a little bit more in that. I'll come on to how we look at speaking up a little bit, and we'll link these in with the kind of more practical tips for that once I go through face-to-face, because the face-to-face setting is very different. There's no camera, although hybrid meetings make that a challenge somewhat, but let's assume you're the one in the room. So you're going into the room. Okay, so one thing I recommend doing is just making sure you get there in time. Okay, so you're not kind of rushing in after everybody's already sat down. And then ideally trying to find yourself a seat at the table where you are somewhere in the middle, so that makes it easier for you to look around the whole table. When it's collaborative, that's what you want to look to do. So you can, easy to make eye contact and smile at everybody around the room. If you're sat in a corner, it can be really hard to kind of engage with the people on your side of the table. However, I do have some caveats there. If you're going into a meeting, you've got someone you really want to influence, or someone that you're particularly trying to build that rapport with, it can be quite a good idea to try and sit near them. And even just subtle things like when you're pouring yourself a glass of water, you can pour one for them. There's ways that you can build those gestures in, okay, to somebody by sitting near them. If you are somebody who doesn't want to sort of interrupt and struggles to kind of jump into the conversation, then absolutely sit somewhere you can be seen by the chair, so the chair of the meeting, that you can look them in the eye and kind of do that thing where you're like, and that's telling them you've got something to say, but you don't want to interrupt anyone. It's essentially their job to make sure that when the other person finishes talking, they say, oh, I think Sam had something to say as well. And that kind of makes it a little bit easier for you. But again, they need to have good sight of you for that to work. So where you're sitting, there's not really a best place, but it is more about what you want to get out of that meeting as to where the best place might be. And then body language in meetings is much more visual. It's all over, you can see it everywhere. So you really do try and make sure that you're staying focused on the conversation. The biggest distraction there is phones. I know it's kind of almost a norm that you bring your phone into a meeting, and almost polite that you put it face down. That's the polite way of saying, I'm not looking at this. But you're still saying it's important enough that I keep it out though, just in case something does buzz. So really, ideally, you want to just not have your phone in sight, so completely out of sight. And that's probably going to feel a bit weird for us when we're so used to having our phone in front of our screens when we're working at home, no one can see what we're doing. But in the meeting environment, avoid having your phone out at all, so you can pay full attention and fully listen to the people in the room. Body language, make sure that you're looking towards the people that are talking, okay, so that you're facing them. And some of you might have heard me talk about feet with body language before. Your feet are instinctively the most natural part of your body when it comes to body language, because they are the part that fight or flight that actually runs away. So as soon as your body's feeling something, your feet will kick into action. What this tends to mean in meetings, right? And I'm conscious when I say this, you're going to start watching people a little bit closely. But if you are putting both your feet towards one person in the meeting, okay, so if I'm putting both my feet towards one person and there's 8 people around that table, I'll be talking to that person, but I'm actually excluding all these other people, because in order for me to talk to them, can you see what I'm doing with my shoulder? I've got to turn around. Whereas if I've got my foot open, right, I've just opened my foot, now you can see my shoulder's already opened a little bit, so I can turn without turning my shoulder. So if I'm facing like this with my feet towards one person, I'm excluding everybody else. And if my feet are open, I'm talking collaboratively to everybody else. So you've probably all been on the receiving end of this, I know I have, where somebody's at a table, they're clearly not talking to you. They're in a meeting, they're talking to somebody, but it's not directed to you. You kind of don't feel involved in the conversation, even though it's at a round table that you're on. And that will, if you look down at what's going on, that will probably be their feet focused on that one person. So from your point of view, you want to make sure that you are open to talking to everybody and involving everybody in that conversation with your body language there as well. Okay, so I want to get on to the confidence tips, because I know a lot of the time it's just that feeling that holds you back from making an impact in meetings, and that voice in your head. I'm going to do a session on the voice in your head separately, because I have touched on it twice this week, and it is a bit of a big topic. So we will schedule that in, but let's take a bit of a shortcut around that theory for the minute. Essentially, your brain is broken down and has two vocal parts, two voices that are going to battle at each other when it comes to these meetings. One of them is going to be telling you all the things that make you feel emotion, make you anxious. Things like, don't ask that, that's a stupid question. Everybody's going to be laughing at you. Or when they come out of the meeting, everyone's going to realise that you're the one that said that ridiculous thing, or you pronounced that word wrong, or whatever it might be that goes on in your head. It's there for all of us. Everybody has it. The skill, and it's a learned skill, this is a habit you want to develop, is the response back to it. Okay, so that voice is always going to be there. What you'll also have is a logical part of your mind that's very rational, that goes, well, yeah, but if I've got this question, then other people are going to have it, and it's much better if I ask the question and I keep up, and also then I'm participating in the meeting, so I'm sure people will want me to ask the question rather than sit here and have no idea what's going on. And in the same sense, if somebody came to you and said, I'm really nervous about asking this question, it would be really natural for you to give all this really logical, simple advice, because the answer feels obvious when you give it to somebody else. But when it's in your own head, this emotional side is loud and chaotic and all over the place. So we want to focus on the logical part of the brain. And what we want really is some practical ways that you can feel tooled, ready to go, with some different ways that are going to eliminate that voice from really jumping into action. So the first one I'd recommend is to always arrive early or on time. On Zoom, that means, you know, bang on the dot. Okay, 1 minute past, you're probably already kind of missing this boat a little bit. So bang on the dot. In person, you usually have a couple more minutes here to balance that. But the reason this is really key is because there will be small talk at the beginning. There'll be that, hey, how's everyone doing? Let's just wait for a few people to come in. Oh, it looks like you've got something fun going on in your background, and all that kind of stuff that we do. And that really, it's quite nice to just calm you down and settle you in and remind you that the other people in the room are actually people. You know, that there's a bit of kind of sort of humanity around the way you're engaging with them, rather than when you jump into all the kind of technical conversation. So it's a really nice way of settling in. But the other thing I really encourage you to do at the beginning is to say something as quickly as possible. And it can be anything, okay? Like just simply come off mute and say, good morning, and then go back on mute. That would be enough. Because the longer you say without saying something, it becomes like a pressure cooker. It gets more and more intense. And then you're thinking, oh my God, it's been like 10 minutes now, I haven't said anything, and everybody else has said something. Whatever I say now has got to be really interesting, because everybody's going to be listening to me. It's like a pressure cooker building up, so it feels really, really quite scary by this stage. Whereas if you just come in and say something, even if you're a bit nervous at that point, it's over with, it's done. Then for the rest of the meeting, you've tried your voice. Hey, I don't know if this is just me, but sometimes if I haven't spoken in a meeting, I'm always scared that I'm going to like have to cough, like, because my voice isn't going to work. So just because I've switched rooms, I'm in a new room where I haven't used my voice. So the sooner you say something, the better, to make you feel more relaxed in there as well. What you ideally want to do is introduce yourself. So this is much more important in person. We don't necessarily take time to do this on Zoom, but in person it's very much going to be normal. And what I mean by introduce yourself is make sure you're the one that's doing that introduction. So you might, for example, have someone senior to you who is going to introduce you, which is brilliant. But what you want to do is make sure that they don't use all the words. So what I mean by that, they might go, oh, let me introduce you to Sam. It wouldn't then go, hi, right, nice to meet you. You'd want to then go, hi, yes, I'm Sam, and I'm really keen to help you with X, Y, Z, or I've been really looking forward to meeting you. You're just saying something that shows that you can speak for yourself, is really the point here. So your manager can introduce you, and that's welcome in, but you want that introduction to almost be a shared one where you then get to speak for yourself. If it's a meeting that you're actually running, so one that you're responsible for, it's really worth sending out some kind of instruction in advance, like an agenda, even if you don't necessarily think there's much of a need for an agenda. Because what this will do is just make it really clear to everyone that it's your meeting. So if you're someone who kind of feels like your meetings might get hijacked a little bit, just doing that kind of groundwork of sending a message before saying, this is what we're going to cover, really looking forward to seeing you all tomorrow, this is the objective of the meeting. Anything really that makes it very clear, you know, I'm running this meeting, and then when people are coming in, we haven't got that kind of uncertainty sometimes we get over whose meeting is this. We've all got a shared goal, but who's running it? So if it's your meeting, you want to make sure you kind of own that from the beginning. Now, we spoke a little bit about extroverts and introverts yesterday, and this comes into play quite nicely with meetings, because essentially we have the constant challenge people talk about in meetings of getting interrupted. Now, getting interrupted is something that is inevitable, it happens, hey? But what tends to happen is you get interrupted by extroverts. Extroverts and introverts, their minds work a bit differently in meetings. The introverts will be thinking about what they're going to say, preparing how they're going to say it, and waiting for their chance to say it. The extroverts will think of an idea and they will want to burst out with excitement of what their idea is before they probably even got the words together. And they'll say things like, oh, let me just think it through out loud. I haven't really thought this through. That's certainly what I say. And they'll just say it all out loud, and it's through excitement and passion of what's come into their mind. Now, it creates a bit of damage when you do that, because what you've probably done is sort of interrupt somebody who was really quite sort of thoughtful on what they were saying. The extrovert doesn't mean any harm by this. I'm not excusing it. I'm going to give extroverts a tip on how to avoid it. But just to know, if you get interrupted, it's usually because they're interested, or whatever you said has given them an idea. It's not because they're shooting down what you're saying. They're building on it. So firstly, don't feel as though that in any way discredits what you're saying. Let them go. This is my suggestion. You let them interrupt you, right? And when they finish what they're saying, you go, yeah, that's great. And as I was saying, and then you can finish your point. So you just pull it back to you at the end. You say something like, yeah, that was great, like with a smile on your face. It basically says, we're still friends. And as I was saying, as in, you did interrupt me, please don't do it again. So it's a really nice way of saying, you interrupted me, but it's okay, right? Because the extrovert, that will be more than enough. They will want to bury their head in the sand like, oh no, gosh, I've got to stop doing that. If you are an extrovert and you find yourself doing that, then my tip, as in the one I use myself, because I really do struggle with this, is to have a pen and paper. Now, I am really not someone that takes many notes in a meeting. I'm quite an active thinker, so I find I take notes afterwards. I'd write down what happened afterwards, not in the meeting. If you find me with a notebook and a pen, what I'll generally be writing down are all the things that I want to say out loud that's going to interrupt somebody. So I write it down, and then I've let it out. I've externalised the idea. The panic has gone. And then I can sit there and let them finish talking and wait to see if somebody else says what I'm going to say. And if nobody does, I can come back to it. Or if the conversation goes a different direction, we get to any other business, I'm there like, actually, there was something I was going to bring up earlier, and I look really measured. So I've like really planned where I'm going to say this. But actually what I've tried to do is just control my instinct of interrupting by jotting it down. And that really does work in terms of helping that instant satisfaction of externalising it, but also of making sure you don't forget what you're going to say, because sometimes the interruption is, if I don't say it now, I'm going to forget it. Now, when you are in the meeting, a really nice tactic you can do that's going to help you build rapport, but as well get people buying into what you're saying, is to use people's names. I know a couple of you were in the session yesterday, actually, so you might have seen me do this. So if I'm in a session and I can see some people with their camera on, I'll always do it to people with the camera on. So yesterday, for example, there was someone called Emma, and I could see Emma was like really engaging with what I'm saying, and I was saying no. So for example, if I was Emma, and as I say Emma, she's like, oh, that's me. So as we talk about someone, hey, so if I'm talking about who was in here, Fran or Sophie, hey, you're like, oh, me, right? Instantly, you're getting a little buzz, just because I said your name. And it's brilliant to use in meetings, because if somebody does that, they're like, and as Sophie was saying, you're like, oh, yeah, they're agreeing with me, this is great. Straight away, you're going to get buy-in from the other person a little bit more. So do make an effort to use people's names and build on their points even more so. So you can say that, as Sophie was saying, and then add to it. Not only does that get the rapport of using her name, but it also means that you're starting with the point that you're both in agreement, and that's a nice way of also kind of having getting Sophie on board with whatever your idea is going to be as well. If you can't think of things to say, hey, you can just compliment what other people were saying. So you can just say, actually, I just want to say, I think that's a really good idea. Or I've seen something like that before, that worked really well. And if it's a really busy meeting, like I say, use the chat box to do this. You don't have to come off mute if you find that that's not the right setting to do so. And I'm gonna just give you one more tip, which is essentially the counting rule. Now, again, we did test this out for something else a couple of days ago. This is essentially what we do when we're panicking. So I want you to picture the scenario, we've probably all been there. You've got something to say in the meeting and you know that it's probably a good point, but you equally are worried that it might not be, and you're talking yourself out of saying it, or certainly this side of your head is. Now, what you want to do is essentially just start counting backwards. Count back from 5. So counting back from 5 will be enough to just temporarily shut off that voice and mean that you can jump in and say what you were going to say. Okay, so if you're finding yourself talking yourself out of the point, count back from 5 and then jump in and say it. Because what we can't do is listen to that voice and count at the same time. So temporarily it's going to shut it off. It's not going to solve it, it's not going to go away, but it will temporarily shut it off. The other counting down from 5 rule is the one I recommend for extroverts. For extroverts, this is a great way of just checking if somebody else is going to say it as well. Because for extroverts, you might find that actually to have a greater impact in meetings, you need to encourage other people to speak up more. So you might be speaking up lots, okay, great, everyone's hearing you. What we also need to do is make sure that other people felt like they were heard in the meeting. So if you feel, if you're kind of getting that sense that you're like, okay, it's probably been me sort of contributing the most now, and there's probably quite a few people in here that might, if they were encouraged, say something else. Then you want to count back from 5 before you say something. Because the introverts will want that kind of couple of seconds silence to come in with what they were going to say, and you'll shoot in there very quickly before. So just slow down, count back from 5, and then see. Okay, so has anyone got an idea on how to? Okay, I do. Right. So just give enough time to see if somebody else does first. It doesn't have to be instant. Okay, that's a run through of some of the practical tips there. We do have a handout actually on this one, which we will send out, I think, in next week's newsletter. I think we've got it planned next week or the week after, certainly. So there'll be a handout with some of these tips in there that you can go through and check against. Because there's quite a lot of them. If I've just gone through all of these, you're probably thinking, oh, how on earth do I think about all of that in a meeting? You don't, right? You just pick 1 or 2 of them that you're going to think about, and you're going to start using. And then you're like, okay, that's working. And then you come back and watch this again, and then you go, right, I'm going to pick out another 2. And I'm going to pick out another 2. And you just take it in stages. You're not just overnight going to do all of this. The other thing you can do is when you walk out of a meeting, you think, that didn't go the way I wanted it to. You can think, what did I not do? What was I missing that I could have done differently? So you can use it as a reflective exercise as well. Because it's not always going to go right. I don't always get it right. God, no. The amount of times I go out and think, God, I spoke too much. Definitely interrupted. Should have let other people answer that question. But as long as you're kind of stopping and you're acknowledging that, that's the best you can do. Because then you're trying to improve it. All right. Has anyone got any questions? Otherwise, we'll jump off and we're going to work out how we're going to schedule these going forward. I think we'll do like a weekly session. And I'm thinking we're going to do them Monday mornings. And we'll run open Q&A, so you can essentially pick the topic. So you can send in questions of things that you want to talk about, and then we'll pick the topic based on what questions people are asking. So you can even send like sort of a scenario that you've got going on, and we won't obviously say who it's from, but we can talk through that in terms of what you might want to do in that situation, or you can just kind of give us broader topics of what you want to do. So keep an eye out on the stories, and we'll see those Q&As coming in there. And otherwise, have a nice weekend. I probably won't be doing another live before the weekend, so have a nice weekend, guys. See you later.